Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being the host today. This talk is an update to a 2022 CACOR talk. We have seen an increasing number of extreme events that suggest the Creator has taken over the climate system with its own agenda. The goal seems to be to reduce the destruction of species on Earth by flooding the fossil fuel industry and the coast to weaken capitalism. Simultaneously, our forecasting ability is being challenged by the increasing global web of managed connections in the complex ocean atmosphere system. Dr. Alan Betts of Atmospheric Research of Pittsford, Vermont, is a leading climate scientist with papers and talks at alanbetts.com. That's ALANBETTS.com. He is a fellow of the American Geological Union, the AGU, the American Meteorological Society, AMS, the Royal Meteorological Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a past president of the Vermont Academy of Science and Engineering. He was the AMS Robert E. Horton Lecturer in Hydrology in 2004, the AMS Jewel Charney Award winner in 2007, and the first recipient of the Bert Bolin Global Environment Change Award from the AGU in 2016. The mission of atmospheric research is to understand the Earth's weather and climate, to develop improved Earth system models, and to help society understand the existential challenge of global climate change as the Creator takes over to save life on Earth. And take it away, Dr. Betts.
That's the second slide. You've moved it on one too many. Go back one. Well, this is just my title. You've already heard all this, but there's a list of papers at the bottom here on which this talk has been based. And I'm going to try and help you understand what's going on in the broadest scale. Next slide. This is just only a few years ago, but it's one of the early winters when on the left you see three of my grandchildren. In the background, you see my house. And it's one of the first winters in 2020 when the ground simply in Vermont did not freeze. So they're digging over in January and I'm digging over in February in the back picture. Next slide. What I'm going to talk about is how the Mother Nature, and I'm using that colloquial phrase, and you'll see why in a moment, is taking over the climate system because the global climate crisis has arrived. Responsibility for this lies in the fact that the fossil fuel empire, which I will talk a bit about, made the decision way back in '78 to destroy the planet for profit, consciously, and have bribed everybody ever since. So it's a clash between the two. Next slide. To frame it as two realities, and the choice that we have to make between them is the here. On the right is what we are familiar with. It's capitalism, what I call the fossil empire, and which interested in natural and human resources, interested in exploiting people and the earth for profit. Goal is to maximize their profit, and they've used money and lies for decades now to bribe and control. And their strategy, of course, and thinking is that we're in charge. And on the left is Mother Nature / Creator. And I'm essentially using these as synonyms, but you'll see the slight difference. It's because the indigenous world understands Mother Nature very well, whose goal is to preserve the web of life. And in a deeper sense, this is here the truth that will set you free. And I'll come back to that. What is very difficult for us to grasp is that the power of Mother Nature and the Creator is unlimited compared to capitalism. And if you can join her, she will help you. And that is also very difficult for us in our Western training to grasp. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through a 4-step analysis here as a keys to understand this transition between this transition here and talk about the takeover of Mother Nature, of the climate system. And I'm going to use in human terms. This is a paper I wrote for the public, for the Green Energy Times, which is a New England newspaper back in October, and it's on my website. The shift to the colloquial image of Mother Nature's taking over the climate system is very powerful, because this indigenous concept has this huge advantage that it's immediately free from the male power syndrome that's contributed so much to the exploitation of the earth and the destruction of life for profit. The second and counter thing is that the Council of Nicaea in 325 was a critical step for the planet. The Roman Catholic Church was created to meet the needs of the Roman Emperor, Constantine, for male power, for warfare, over women, over indigenous people, like Jesus, and nature itself. He destroyed the Aramaic Gospels of the indigenous Aramaic-speaking Jesus, Yeshua, because they referred to the birth of the cosmos and the creation, clearly a damned female concept. Next slide. The third is that the indigenous worldview that understands Mother Nature takes precedence over amoral capitalism, whether we like it or not, and I'll come back to that. And historically, of course, this relates to why the European and North American societies tried so hard to stamp out indigenous thought. But the fourth is the powerful concept that there's the truth that sets us free to act on behalf of the whole of creation. It originated with the indigenous Aramaic teacher Yeshua, and it's still the truth, even though virtually no one understands it. And it was basically very simple, not in any way doctrinal. It was step into the Creator's world and see the interconnected web of the whole of creation, and this will set you free to back the entire creation. And it's essentially what we need to do now to save the planet. Back the creation, not capitalism. In other way, it's related directly to the fact that Mother Nature is taking over to save the species on Earth. Next slide. Now, the indigenous, in a small side step, the indigenous frames are very much a challenge for our society. And I'll take as an example, a Canadian example, that there are 3 indigenous populations living with grizzly bear populations on the west coast of British Columbia. 3 distinct grizzlies populations. We did the genetic analysis, and they haven't interbred for 900 years. And they are aligned to the 3 indigenous language families. There are no physical barriers stopping those bears migrating and breeding together, but they've never done it. It's knowledge sharing that connects the people and the bears. They're culturally connected, and the scientists, many scientists were simply stunned by this. And finally, one asked an elder of one of those communities, and he just smiled. They've been our bears forever. He didn't have the 900-year genetic analysis. Come into the woods and I'll introduce you to mine by name. I've known them since I was 5 years old. Finally, the scientist got it, but he wasn't willing to go into the woods and face a 75-year-old grizzly who could probably read his mind. Next slide. Now, it's very difficult for me to introduce myself and my background, but so I'll do it in a few little steps here. I was trained by a man called Frank Ludlam, absolutely remarkable man who was the bomber forecaster on bomber flights over Europe in 1945, when I was still in the womb under the path of the V1s, trying to bomb them out of existence. And he has a very fundamental principle that's governed my life, and I was quickly taught it and given examples. If something is critical and you're the only one who's really capable, it is your responsibility. And everyone knew that he had trained me in this, so I quickly got involved, and I got involved in the gate experiment on a vast scale because it was happening for geopolitical reasons with all the resources of the world, and no one had written the central plan for it, and no one was there to execute it. And I got both jobs because they said, he could do it. He was trained by Ludlam. But after the experiment, I came back and I said, I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. I asked, who's going to take responsibility for the climate system? Because by then I was an expert on climate over land in the tropics and the ocean climate. And the system basically ignored me. They said, scientists should do what science society tells them, which really meant we're not going to discuss the responsibility of the climate system. And I could tell that all these senior scientists in the US were not really aware of all the issues. So I stepped, given my training, into this. It was a critical issue. So understanding the climate system came to me in 1976. So we aren't quite up to 50 years on that. And I realized I had to step out of academia, refuse tenure. I built a passive solar house. I bought land in Vermont in 76, built a passive solar house, solar panels in 78. And I negotiated with the Science Foundation, NSF, in the United States to fund me as an individual on zero overhead. And they did for the next 30 plus years. An extraordinary thing that freed me to deal with the entire world in a system of mutual trust. It was an extraordinary thing, and I don't have to go into the details here, but everyone knew they could trust me wherever they were in the world because I had no institutions to interfere, and the Science Foundation was funding me in this way. 1980, I said to myself, well, nah, I still have a big task ahead. And I thought I should go searching for the truth. And I asked the basic question of the global community, how to emerge science with wisdom. Next slide. But before I get to that next slide, this is coming, I got to go on the parallel route so we get a clear understanding of the deceit of the fossil empire, which was a couple of years later after my 76 transition. The chief scientist of Exxon told the ExxonMobil, it wasn't Mobil in those days, the impact of doubling CO2 on the climate, and told the management they have only 5 or 10 years before critical decisions to change direction because they were going to destroy the planet. And Exxon silenced him and started the webs of lies. First denial, they bribed Republican deniers, and that cost was really cheap when you're making hundreds of millions practically every day. And now we're in the bizarre situation in the United States where virtually everyone in Congress is accepting money to ignore the fossil fuels, criminal deceit of destroying life on Earth when they knew 40 years ago this was going to happen. But they're all being bribed, Republicans with delight and the Democrats because they have to have money to fight the Republicans. Think of this as global ecocide by the fossil empire to keep the profits flowing with massive political help and subsidies. Next slide. To slip it back into my journey, I asked the question in 1980, how can science be merged with wisdom? And to my astonishment, I was told by I think it was the yoga teacher at the big cathedral at the north end of Manhattan in New York City, go and ask Yogi Ramsarat Kumar in Tiruvannamalai in southeastern India. He would know. In fact, he had the archive of the world's wisdom. We're not even going to have time for that because it's too complicated for this particular thing, unless you ask questions at the end. But on arrival, I slipped into the meditation room of his teacher, Ramana Maharshi, in Tiruvannamalai, and I slipped gratefully into meditation. My attitude was, thank God I've arrived. I've been traveling for 4 days from Colorado. But to my utter astonishment, because I had no concept, the creator noticed me at once and knew that I needed real help for the task in hand, because she could read my mind. And I was taken back and forward through my life for about an hour and shown in a thread in my brain both the past and the future and my connection to the creation. And I was completely transformed. I had no idea any of these things utterly existed. I was ecstatic and joyful for days. I had no idea, so as I said, the creator was watching and managing creation as well. I then sat with a saint, Sathya Sai Baba, another Christ-like figure that Westerners went to go and see, who could just, as people walked around, he could simply read their minds and heal them. He could read my mind. I could tell that right from the beginning, tell me where to go and when to go. And at the end, he stared into my eyes for 3 minutes from about 10 yards away, with an intensity that I will never forget the rest of my life, basically to tell me, this is the last time I will see you, go for it. I then was trained for about 5 years in the indigenous mindset by Dihani Wahu here in Vermont. And much, much later, I filled in all the pieces. Next slide. So I want you to shift as far as you can to an Earth system frame and realize that your basic choice is Mother Nature or the fossil empire. Mother Nature, the creator, is in charge, and she is the indigenous frame. She waited 40 years, roughly from 1980 to 2020, to give us time to take action. We refused, of course, because we were too busy making money as a societies around the world. She's now taken over to save life, species, but not capitalism. And I'm going to explore recent climate disasters from Mother Nature's perspective. Next slide. So this is a graphic, and I'm going to give you some graphical pictures, but this is just the first one that really struck my attention. Northwest US and British Columbia, extremes in the towards the end of June 2021, when temperatures were 4 or 5 centigrade above historic maximum. And in Canada, the Canadian record that had stood somewhere on the prairies for 80 years was wiped by a 4 or 5 centigrade and 8 Fahrenheit. And ended in fire. And then a Pacific river came along, atmospheric river, and dumped a month of rain in 2 days on the burnt regions of British Columbia, turned what was essentially ground pebble into a slush of floating stuff that closed the Canadian highway, Trans-Canadian Highway and railway, cutting off the export of liquid natural gas from the tar sands that were destroying life on Earth. Next slide. This is a picture of Western, I don't know if you can see my mouse. This is the Vancouver Island, and here is Seattle, and all this dark red here are temperatures basically over 110 Fahrenheit, because this picture was drawn in the US thing, 110 Fahrenheit, 43 centigrade. Now, if those of you who know this area, typically this was something like 70 degrees in a wet climate traditionally, and here we have 40 degrees more in Fahrenheit, and basically wet and rainy, and well, no, it's not wet and rainy on these days. A totally different climate. People cheerfully say this is the one in 1,000 years. It's climate change, obviously. Next slide. It's totally different. This is one drawn by someone for Lytton, British Columbia, a little forest town in the forest of Western British Columbia, by Scott Duncan, where the Canadian record on the same 3 days was crushed by the figures I mentioned before, nearly 5 centigrade, until it reached almost 50 centigrade. Think of this as being almost desert temperatures in a Canadian forest, 121 Fahrenheit, till it all burst into flames and destroyed large areas. The rain came for 2 days in November, a month of rain in 2 days that closed the Trans-Canadian Highway because everything was turned to floating mush, cutting off the fossil fuel exports. So that one was what I think essentially woke me up to what was going on, because these situations were unthinkable from the historic perspective. Next. Just to show the continuation there and the connection in Canada, Storm Fiona that came along in a whole year later in this case, most extreme storm ever to hit Eastern Canada with $1 billion in damage. And just to say that from the perspective of the Earth, the floods will continue as Canada develops fossil fuel industries to make billions destroying the Earth. And those of you who are Canadian understand that Ottawa does not control what goes on in the Western states. And on the same day, week practically, Hurricane Ian came up the west coast of Florida, slowed down and stopped, amplified up to very close to Category 5. I'm not sure what the final designation of that one was. And the context there is rather different. It is that, as I perceive it, and of course I have no documents on this, DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he's anti-climate change, anti-renewable energy. He has a near-fascist mentality that's doing all sorts of things at the moment. And Mother Nature can read his mind. Now, I can't prove something like that, but to me, I look at that and to me, it's obvious. Hurricane Nicole came along a little while. My comment to you is, of course, don't build on the coast, wake up and realize that Mother Nature and the Creator does know what she's doing. Next slide. This is moves us into another world. I'm going to pick up Antarctica. Antarctica has, someone put the pointer on this one. This is Western Antarctica, Eastern Antarctica is the red there. And basically, Western Antarctica is shallow ice. a few feet of sea level. It's melting. We can't do much about it. But we always thought that East Antarctica, which is a 10,000-foot ice mountain that contains 150 feet of sea level, we didn't have to worry about for 1,000 years, perhaps. But on this day, which is now 2 years ago, the Earth simply moved and you can't see this, the Australian mid-tropospheric air 5,000 miles south and parked it over the Antarctic ice cap. And the temperature went up 40 centigrade, 70 Fahrenheit in 2 days to melting point. And the scientists sitting on the lab at the top were absolutely stunned. One of them said, "This is impossible, impossible. If you told me this was going to happen 3 days ago, I would never, never, never have believed you." But he was smart enough to say 2 days later, well, it did happen. And it looks as if the Earth is exploring how to melt all the ice caps if needed. Notice that's a huge step forward for scientists to recognize the role of the planet here. But even if ice cap melt gives us only 20 to 40 foot sea level, it will rein in the catastrophic behavior of humanity. But I discovered just writing this talk, switch to the next slide, that there's another facet here that I knew nothing about until last month, is that the Arctic circumpolar current, I didn't show you that there's a complete circle around Antarctica, free from continental barriers. It links all the oceans. It's a global climate conveyor belt distributing heat and nutrients across the oceans. It's huge and powerful in the sense that I wasn't aware of at all. The ocean floor in many places is 4,000 meters deep, and it spans widths of up to 2,000 kilometers, this current. And over the last few decades, it's got 40% stronger. It just happened, only again last month, that this group of authors here, Lamy et al., did finish 5 million years of retrospective analysis of the Antarctic circumpolar current strength and variability. And they showed the link between warming, speed up, and major loss of Antarctic ice on the large timescales driven by circulation changes of the Earth and other changes in the Earth system. So it looks as we're now moving into that, driven now by the climate warming that the fossil empire is creating to make money. And the implication is that we're going to probably face much larger sea level rise and floodings of the coast, driven from the Antarctic circulation. Next slide. Shift now your mentality to the Eastern Australian coal mines, which are shown on the east of this picture. These little tiny little circles here. Those are the eastern, from Queensland in the north down to Sydney and New South Wales in the south. You probably many of you may not have been aware, go to the next slide, that Eastern Australia is the largest coal exporter in the world. $44 billion in profits, massive cash in profits every year. And they also have no concept of responsibility. If you shift down to the bottom there, they claim they have no responsibility for climate change because the coal is burnt somewhere else, which means and the profits, of course, are huge for them. It means that there's no honest discussion of what happened in this particular July 2022 period. 4 feet of rain fell on Sydney and its coal mines. Queensland had a series of floods, and they're all linked to huge change in the circulation of the Pacific. More floods came along in October up the whole eastern coast, and people cheerfully said it's become uninhabitable. Some areas in October got 4 times the mean October rainfall in just 24 hours. Things got more catastrophic floods in November, and rescue teams had to be summoned from New Zealand because the Australian rescue teams were exhausted. But as I said, Australia has no responsibility. Mother Nature disagrees. And this was a classic example where we can't get an honest description of most of this because it's all being concealed by the Australian government. Next slide. I now want to have a quick review of the global climate status, because what has been going on in the last basically 12 months has stunned even forecasters. We had a Paris climate agreement back in 2015 that we would keep below a threshold of 1.5 degrees of the basically the early in the century climate on a global scale. But in 1923, global temperatures rose. Normally the maximum is in March because this is the end of the Southern Hemisphere summer. But temperatures in 23 rose in April, May, June, July, August, September onward. And they're still rising now in 24 in February and March. Now, this is really very difficult for the forecasters to understand. Scientists started to worry, yes. And Gavin Schmidt is a famous NASA GIS, and he said it's very disquieting. We haven't known what is going on since March of last year. Now think about that. We're now 1 year into a transition of the global climate in terms of global SSTs, not just the little things that we see on our local scale, and we don't understand what's going on. And to me, this is not surprising at all. The scientific community and the forecast community has not grasped that the takeover of the climate system by the creator to save life on Earth means the rule book has changed. It's changed outside our historic analyses in ways we do not yet understand, and we may never understand because it's being monitored by a very powerful, intelligent entity. The last is just a comment here. Storm systems coming up the East Coast this winter. I've seen flooding and historic winter temperatures. But go to the next slide, where there's another quick review of East Coast rainstorms, because in last year, we've had them, whole waves of them. I've listed 3 here. The Great Vermont Flood, as it was called, 9 inches across the mountains in Montpelier, that matched the flooding from Tropical Storm Irene, which was a big disaster for us. But it meant people were prepared for this. Torrential rain just in my local county in August last year. Flood waters in September from Ophelia inundating the whole coast from the south upwards to New York. And in September the 30th specifically, massive rain fell across New York City and flooded, I think, the subways. Next slide. So just to put this reminder back, this is our fundamental choice. It is a choice. Most of the people in our society are being bribed in one way or another, or misled, to stick with the thinking of capitalism and the fossil empire, that we are in charge, our job is to make money, and so on. And how you have to lie and use money to keep everybody under control, well, that's just the way it is. Versus the creator's view of the world, which is infinitely more powerful and could take you into a different world altogether. And you can join her. If you join her, since she can read your mind, even at the individual level, everything changes for you and those around you. Next slide. So a comment on the human talents and limits. When the massive eruption of Hunga Tonga volcano, now back 22 January, came, the shockwave circled the Earth many times, both directions, but first sent a tsunami across the Pacific. With our network of satellites and models, we track everything precisely and we give warnings, so everybody knows when it's coming on, say, in this case, the West Coast. But the scientists notice that the creatures along the Pacific coast simply move to higher elevations well before the approaching tsunami is visible. And they always do that. And they get frustrated, the scientists, because they don't, how they know when they don't read our satellite data? Well, the ecologists mutter to them. Mother Nature just tells them to move and they listen. We think we're the intelligent ones in charge. But we're actually the only species foolish enough not to listen to the creator. I'll come back to this, I think, on my very last slide. We're the only species because our technology is our current substitute. But we're going to have to surrender to her perspective as the climate extremes increase. And this is very, very, very hard for many to grasp. Next slide. So this is my first closing slide. It's my suggestions to you. Discuss this talk. Listen to the spread of different reactions. Anyone who feels connected to Mother Nature and would like to go deeper, connect with her and report back. Try connecting in pairs with diversity, male, female, whatever it takes. See how your group dynamics change and your relationship to Mother Nature. But I'm not going to stop there. I think I have two more. The next one is something that you would not think of at all, but I was forced to. Can the creator bypass our physics, what we as scientists, as we were trained? And yes, she can. She's responsible for the physics. And the example I have is one where I experienced, she chose to suspend gravity to teach me a lesson I will never forget. I was sitting on a rock by a rushing stream in the Adirondacks, it's in one of the papers, and I was lifted up from a cross-legged position, arms first. My joints simply unfolded underneath me smoothly and elegantly from a cross-legged position. Now, there's no way I can stand up from a cross-legged position with my arms going up first, smoothly and elegantly. Impossible. But I was. And I was thrown immediately into a dance for the four directions, which in the indigenous world, which I was trained in by Dahani Wahoo here in Vermont, I had understood, but I had subtly, very subtly misunderstood it in human terms, as opposed to the actual intervention of the creator to teach something new when she talked about a place where she learned a new dance. Very, very subtle, but the creator decided I needed to know the difference. So I was given a new dance. And I could have opted out. I mean, I wasn't going to do that because I knew immediately this was an intervention of something I needed to know. And I was basically just being shown the truth of who's really in charge. I danced for an hour. I was not allowed to capture it. I'm not a native teacher. I was not allowed to capture it. If I tried to encapsulate it in another part of my brain, it started to dissolve. All I could do was dance it until I could dance no longer. It was designed to show me the truth of who's really in charge. So switch to the very last slide. This is a review of what I had few slides back. Technology is our substitute. When the tidal wave came across, the satellites tracked it precisely and gave out warnings. As always, the mobile creatures moved uphill to be safe, and the scientists muttered, how do they know without our satellite data? The ecologists whisper, Mother Nature tells them, and they listen. This is our really, really difficult challenge, and you will all appreciate this. We too have to listen. We have to listen. And this is so difficult for both politics and science. Thank you. I think we go for questions now.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And Paul Beckwith is the first questioner. I invite others to put your questions and comments in the chat, and I'll take you in order. Go ahead, Paul.
Do I get to see you?
Yes, please turn on your video and your microphone, Paul.
Or you can ask your question.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Very interesting talk. The ongoing flooding today in Dubai, ironically, is putting planes or taxiing through water, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where the last climate conference was, and I think they've had almost a year's worth of rain cause this massive flooding. So that kind of supports your idea. I mean, the heart of the fossil fuel company getting hammered by Mother Nature. I do have some other questions, First, very interesting talk again. I'm curious about the funding that you got from the NSF, the 5-year chunks of money, because that sounds like an, very, very favorable thing that you managed to get to keep you independent. So did you have, how did you get it? And did you have some deliverables like report every 5 years, that sort of people can look at? to see what you were up to all these years?
Well, the simple answer is everything I've done has been published. I mean, I've always been open access, so it's all on my website, all the work I've worked on. What it did for me, the context there is that I was already a famous scientist. And I did know Jay Fine at the National Science Foundation at the time. So I did talk to him. And I basically said, I don't know what I said to him, but I basically asked him whether he could fund me as an individual with zero overhead. So it was a very relatively low sum of money, no bureaucracy, and it would set me free to be able to do what I wanted. And I think I had to explain to him the broader context that, of the climate system of the planet that I'd taken on a few years earlier. In context, what it did was give me, and he agreed. I mean, he could have cut it off at any time. So he must have been, I sent him just simply annual reports of what I had done. And I acknowledged it, the support.
Yes.
It set me up for a global view. It meant I could travel around the world and everybody knew essentially they could trust me because I had no bureaucracy, either at the academic level, the institutional level, and I had British and American citizenship. And the classic response I would get when I asked for help, and there were no financial interchanges. I didn't pay people for stuff. And I would ask someone, say in South America, can you help me with such and such? And the attitude I got was the astonishing, yes, of course. We can't do it tomorrow. We can do it next week. Now, if you can understand that from a scientist,
Okay.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
No
Well, thank
exchange.
you. Yeah, no, that sounds wonderful.
And then I would give them I cite them, quote them, and put the name on papers.
Right. Now let's get to Gwynne Dyer's book. Climate. It's called Climate Intervention, just published. I don't expect you to have heard of it or read of it, but it's all about climate engineers. It's about people working on carbon dioxide removal, on solar radiation management techniques. You may have heard of an experiment recently off California, off an aircraft carrier to create small salt crystals in the air for marine cloud brightening and things. So
we could try and manage everything. But the basic problem, which we are not facing at all, is that we've had this criminal enterprise to destroy the planet for profit that no one in US politics certainly will face. The very first victory on that, I believe, was sometime in the last few weeks in Switzerland, where a bunch of elderly ladies challenged the system and said, this is criminal to destroy the earth for profit. And they won. And the reverberations are still going on. Both in Switzerland and around the EU. Our attitudes have to change. We can't just engineer our way out of this when the whole purpose of our engineering has been largely to deceive. Next question.
Any further comments, Paul? I hate to leave you. Anything off the top of your head? Screen. Yeah, he was walking. I was wondering if he was going to walk out of range, and that might have happened. Mary Hagan has the next question, but John Hollins is on deck. So go ahead, Mary.
Alan, I identify with a lot of things you say, and I'm an activist on trying to live with nature at the local level. So my question to you, and you live in one of my favorite states within the United States for linking with ecology and nature, is how do you talk to your neighbors and your nearby friends about your experiences and help them apply what you believe in?
It depends how much they're willing to listen to. I mean, I have been here now for 50 years, almost. And so there's a very wide range of people that I talk to. I certainly write for the newspapers here and give talks. And one of the pair of slides early on about the 4 steps was in the papers and discussed here. It's very difficult to answer a question. You have to understand, I live in a parallel universe. So I mostly connect at the intuitive level. And if I walk into a store and I think someone is interested in the topic, I start to talk. And if they pick me up and they connect, I will give them my card and I'll tell them where to start. Because I have business cards that are in my pocket right now, but I can't give you one. And I find that the people that connect, they connect. And I can't connect with everybody. But I know at an intuitive level who is listening. And I don't recall. I've also, unfortunately, I'm 79 this year, and I'm losing my short-term memory. I remember the past and the things I'm talking about now very well. Some of them will be there on the day I pass away. But the local stuff and the local everything, I don't remember all the details anymore. My wife has to keep track of a lot of things for me. So I can't really answer your question, except to say I live in this other universe, and I'm not a campaigner in the classical sense. I don't try and force people to understand what I think. If they're listening, I tell them, and I give them a connection to my world that they can follow it up. Okay. And then they may come back a year or so later and they say, oh, thank you for such and such and such and such, blah, 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 and they tell me their feedback. But I'm a gardener, so I connect with the people on that level too.
Okay. That's very, very helpful. CACOR is developing a new 5-year strategy on how we collectively and individually can proceed in addressing a lot of these things. So I think that was very valuable in helping our thinking. Thank you.
Well, I'd be happy to. I'm not going to do it in the normal framework, because as I said, I was forced essentially by, first of all, my all the levels of training I had. I mean, you have to understand, I started in a system where my high school was founded in 1513 and my college 1284. And my teachers there were the 2 men who discovered myoglobin and hemoglobin, and their expectations were transformative. And then I went to Frank Ludlam, who lived in a parallel universe himself, because he could do all the stuff in his brain. And said, you better get out into the real world and get real hands-on expertise. And he sent me to Venezuela to get direct expertise of what could and could not be done with our present knowledge. And that was transformative for me too, because I discovered that the world expert simply couldn't. And therefore I came back and did it myself. Next.
John Hollins, will you excuse me? I'm going to bring Paul Beckwith back in. He's in a stable situation. He will not walk out of range.
Of course, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Paul. You have a book.
Yeah, I apologize. My phone battery. I think I need a new phone probably. But anyway, this is a book, Intervention Earth by Gwynne Dyer. The point is that there's lots of work being done now on climate interventions or work by, there's groups called Restoring a Healthy Climate. There's lots of people are working on ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Direct air capture is getting some big funding. And also on the other side is solar radiation management stuff is becoming very important. James Hansen's work shows that sulfur has a much larger effect than many people thought. So we've removed sulfur from shipping fuels. And as a result, according to Hansen and some corroborating work, temperatures are skyrocketing in both the oceans and atmosphere now. So, if we put sulfur into the stratosphere, we can cause an enormous cooling of the planet. This happens during volcanoes. But these ideas are very controversial to the science community and mainstream communities at the moment, but that's changing, I think, as temperature, as climate catastrophes skyrocket. So how does this fit in with your sort of views on Mother Earth. I mean, would Mother Earth be supporting humans to try to intervene with technological interventions to stabilize the climate, or is that something that you think the potential to make things worse is greater, and that should stop us from doing such human interventions?
Well, you're asking for a simplistic answer to something where we failed to do any of this for 40 years for financial and political reasons. And we may not do it very well because we have no sense of how to manage our technology really intelligently. And we are unwilling still to connect to the creation itself, which is much more powerful than we are. So the answer is, yes, but I can't expect our society, our technological society, which is focused in its technological world and trying to make money out of it at the same time, with all the political structures that we have, really to get it all right. Because it has no morals, no ethics, no values.
Okay, however, I would argue that none of that apparatus is required that you're talking about. All that's required is some billionaire coming along saying, hey, this looks like a cool idea, let's do it. And
Yes.
until something is actually done,
Yes.
it cannot be regulated not to be done, right?
Oh,
That's the way things work. So you can't have regulations saying you can't do all of this stuff until it's actually done. And I would argue, okay, let's put the sulfur back in the shipping fuels. That was a total mistake to pull it out in 2015, tighten the regulations in 2020. It's causing us huge problems. So we need that sulfur back in the shipping fuels until we, get time to do other things, right? I mean, it was taken out for air pollution reasons. There was actually no foresight of other side effects that might happen.
We don't understand side effects at all with a technological model. So you're right in one sense, but who is going to get agreement on that when there's various people making money out of the system? And we have certainly in the United States, we have a desperately corrupt central government, desperately getting worse all the time. So I hear you, go ahead. Controlling climate change from our impacts would help. Whether we can manage it with our technology when our technology is 100% being misused and has been for 50 years, I doubt.
Yeah.
And the intervention. So I can't answer your question.
Yeah.
Try
I mean,
it and see if you can get any agreement on a fundamental thing there. And
I mean, it's going to be deployed. Let me put it that way.
We're going to start, did you say?
We're going to start using these technologies and deploy them at scale.
We are,
and then we will see the consequences, whether they work or not, or make things worse.
Right.
I would argue that the risks of not doing anything are far worse, and we know them. We know what's happening. So I think we have to have a go at trying these things. That's
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. Realize, though, you're part of a much, much bigger picture. That is, some of this stuff is also being controlled at the planetary scale by the creation. And you have no control on that either. So, for example, we could lose Musk's satellite systems just like that. And we have no control over that, simply because of their global role in various ways. But I can't speak for the creation. All I can say is the system is not being managed by us. And most of our management has been deeply corrupt, deeply dishonest, and we keep fighting over these bits and pieces. So good luck.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, John Hollins, you are next, and I have a follow-up comment to your question, John.
Thank you very much. Yes, Dave, thank you for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Look, I did not know that Australia is the largest exporter of coal, but now you've said it, I'm not surprised at all. I should have known. But Australia says it's not responsible. Now, that's another question.
So does Canada.
I've done 3 or more decades of energy systems analysis, and the sort of in passing, the ability to analyze systems is totally lacking in the government of Canada. I think even worse than in your government. So we don't really understand that. But look, if let me give you my analysis has always pointed to demand as the driver of supply in energy systems. So the government of Australia has at least part of a point there. If you just you're not in, you live in the United States, I live in Canada. There's a classic example of a major long-term retailer by the name of Eaton's that closed its stores after about a century of operation, not because it didn't have anything to sell, but because the customers stopped shopping there and went somewhere else. So to some degree, I recognize that advertising influences decisions made by purchasers, not by me, I don't think, and not by you. What do you make of that?
I'm not sure what your question is. You started with Australia, where the
I've
Australian government is very simple. They simply said when they were asked that they did not have to take any responsibility for where the coal was burnt. They were simply exporting it. And that has influenced all their politics around the coal, so to speak, because anybody tried to challenge them on that, they just simply said, we're not responsible for the coal. We're simply the exporters. But these other, so I'm not sure what your question is. You're asking about some firm at Eaton that I don't know.
I'm trying to have a conversation. I did not ask a question. I tried to make a point, and that is that the government of Australia has some justification in what it's saying, because Australia, being one of the Commonwealth countries, one of the rich countries of the OECD, has functioned for a long time in the markets. The governments fiddle with the markets on the margins quite often. Our government just did that yesterday in its annual budget. But ultimately, if nobody buys Australia's coal, there won't be a problem.
Well, sure, but the coal market still exists in the world, and they're exporting to that. All this is true, but to me, it's the lack of values at all places in this system that is the problem. The lack of values, responsibility, the lack of what I call wisdom. And the fact that we have our technological society and we have all these exports and transfers and stuff around the world, and nobody, our goal as a society is capitalism, primarily, just to simplify it. And when you look, there's lots of things being rewritten now on how capitalism really was based in the United States, as the example, on slavery in the last century. And it's all been covered up in many, many different ways and papered over, but basically our system, our financial system, does not have ethics, values, morals, wisdom, and all the things that have led to destruction. And we're cheerfully moving to destroy the planet because of that.
Yes, indeed. Now, look, the government in Canada, and I think in all the democratic countries, has a very short time horizon most of the time until the next election. It's never more than 4 years, and it's often much less than that. They just don't seem to have the ability to come to terms with the issue which we share here. Have you had any success with connecting with political decision makers?
I can't even answer that one because
Okay.
I'm
No,
not.
no. I mean,
I
we
can't
have
answer that one.
I've tried as an individual with some very modest success, but it's extremely difficult. But in my country, that's the key to open the door. Anyway, thank you very much. And my friend Dave Doherty probably has something to say now.
Well, he actually declined to make his comment, so I will read it. Demand can be manipulated via advertising, lobbying, and sales techniques. And if I could just add, now with AI, it feels like the general public is so easily manipulated, even when humans are in charge of the scripts and the platforms. Now that AI is here, to manipulate us further. I mean, that might be part of the problem of why people burn coal is that, well, it's cheaper and you got to stay warm. So you need electricity and kick the wisdom down the road because I have immediate needs. Any further comment on that, or should we move on, Ellen?
No, I don't really. I'm just really speaking to there are structures and roles for everything that we have in our system. And you're right. It happens at many levels. And it's basically to enable all those scales to just go on. And no, that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about a much broader framing of the issues. And
we can move on.
Yes, move on.
Okay. Richard Vanderjet, you are on deck. Oh, excuse me, you are the next questioner. And let's see who is on deck. I will send you an individual email who's ever on deck. You can turn your camera on. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can see me, but I just wanted to, I tried to turn on my camera, but it doesn't really matter. You can hear my voice. Yes?
I can hear your voice.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. It was a good talk. I enjoyed it. I guess the biggest problem that I can see right now is number one, and as you pointed out, the corruption of the politicians, which somehow needs to be discouraged or blocked. And the second thing, which is a huge problem, is the apathy of the populace. Because everybody feels, well, no one else is making change, so any little change that I can make isn't going to make a difference. And somehow we need to get that message out in a very strong way that people need to make change now, not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but they need to start making changes. And these are the areas where they can start. And I don't see that happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really, there's a real vacuum of direct advice to your average Joe out on the street. Would you agree?
Well, I certainly agree. That's the fundamental problem. The whole system has been managed by the various aspects of society to maintain what they have, to keep it going, and to keep people out of trouble. That is involving and really doing something. And well,
Well, I noticed yesterday that on the budget that came out, again, they're talking about carbon capture, which is just a way of kicking the can down the road. It does nothing, and it's never going to accomplish something. If you look at the percent of emissions that carbon capture actually changes anything, it's less than a tiny percentage of the amount of CO2 emissions that are out there. And yet people have this view that, oh, carbon capture will take care of it. And it's kicking the can down the road. It does nothing.
Well, I agree with you. And that's why I'm taking a different perspective altogether. And it is true that I'm not charged with solving these problems for society, because I live in a society which is so corrupt, they won't listen to me. They, for the most part, I mean, the fact that what we see is the development by people who have money, who are trying to make money out of the system as they move around various topics. And in most cases, they're moving towards complexity of multiple flows of things. And as you say, the political corruption of the system is very deep. And I'm not trying to solve it for them. I'm simply trying to tell them what is happening and what will happen. And I can expect, I'm waiting for people to actually understand what is happening. But I really don't even feel competent at the moment to answer your question. I look at these things that are going on with the various branches of a political system, and I just say, yep. And the multiple onward sweep on and on and on as greater complexity is introduced to try and justify, self-justify. And I can't think of specific examples because I'm not set up to answer your question. So go for it is my sense. You think about the issues here and what is your responsibility in the deeper picture of what we face? Because the creator is not listening to that stuff. She is simply going to take on what is happening at the coasts and, if necessary, simply flood the people at the coasts to wipe out the infrastructures and the this and that. Because it's a better way of dealing with capitalism.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Hakim is on deck, and Dave Doherty, you have the floor. Next question, comment.
They're not really questions. I have several observations / comments. The first one is that in your discussion with Paul Beckwith, it occurred to me surely we ought simply to reduce the burning of fossil fuels rather than to proceed with what I will call the what could possibly go wrong geoengineering solutions.
Well, I don't disagree with that. Reducing the burning of the fossil fuels. What is driving that? It's driving it in various places in the world because people have money invested in it. And certainly reducing it would be a big step forward. But if you have something that is driven by the burning of coal, for example, what are you going to replace it with? Are you going to go through a broader transition and replace it with solar power, for example?
Well, two observations on that. One is we certainly do have probably all the technology we need to electrify everything, at least everything that's really meaningful. Secondly, and this is related to that comment that I made earlier, we're all actually subject to advertising, marketing, sales, influence. And there's an awful lot of stuff that we buy that we really actually don't need to buy. And when you think about electrifying everything, no, we don't really need to electrify everything. A broom is fine. You don't need a vacuum. I'd like to move on to my second comment. We're talking about top coal exporters, just so that it's clear to Canadians in particular who might be listening to this. Canada's number 6 on the list of coal exporters. We're quite far behind Australia and some of the other top countries, but we are in the top 10 as usual. we're in the top 10 for emissions. We're in the top 10 for emissions per capita. And that's at home, not, in foreign nations. We don't burn a whole lot of coal at home anymore, though. And a lot of the exported coal is what they call metallurgical coal used to make steel, but in any case. I wanted to clarify that I was able to locate a paper from Nature, which is probably a pretty reliable source. Premature mortality from shipping emissions. In the 2020 business as usual case, about 400,000 people per year. Confidence interval basically about 212 to 595. So it's a lot of people. When you say, well, we can just put those emissions back in, how are we going to justify that in terms of the number of people we're going to kill by doing so? I don't think it can be justified. Okay, there's a third comment, just a second. I don't see it here. It doesn't really matter. I would like to point out that while I was looking for that article, I found something very interesting. It was predicted that deaths would go down when emissions were cut from shipping. And so far, it's only a couple of years, the opposite has been found, which kind of reminds me about some very interesting natural experiments that happened with healthcare. When doctors went on strike, you might think that mortality would go down. Sorry, would go up. What did we find? Mortality went down. This happened in Israel and it happened in Canada in particular, in Saskatchewan. Why would that happen? Well, it was because of things that we really hadn't stopped to consider might be the case. There's a lot less medical error when doctors are not at work.
I can't analyze what you're saying in any way, except each of these issues is something that someone can now analyze, and they won't always find what they expected. And you're giving perfect examples of that. The broader picture here is the structure and ethical structure behind our analyses, our efforts, our management of all these things is usually dubious because it has other agendas behind it. And usually profits for individuals are part of that. And I can't analyze, give you any details of any of this stuff. I'm stepping, because I have an unfortunate fact that I live in a parallel universe. I really live in a parallel universe. All my life, I have had to make decisions that make sense from my individual perspective of things without having, or not tied to money. Whereas in our society, the corruption of our system and its financial agendas has been very, very bad.
Interesting. I have one other thing. I'll type this in as a question in the chat in a moment, so that we have it for the record. I'm very interested in whether, if the creator, as you labeled it, is in fact so powerful, how is it that the creator allowed things to get to the current situation?
The creator has million-year timescale. The creator actually gave us 40 years to get it together, from basically 1980 to 2020. I can't speak for her. I have no idea why. But we were given an interval, and the intervention now basically is probably going to be very devastating for our society and its strategies, mentalities, and attempt to control things. And we will just not have a choice. I mean, just look at this last year where everything that has happened in the last year basically is moving our ability to forecast what is going on, and also moving clearly towards a situation where our ability to control what happens at the coasts is likely to go. And how are we going to decide where, if, say, our major cities and their agendas simply get wiped out gradually over a space of maybe 5 years? What are we going to do about that? We can complain and whine and complain, and we can do nothing about it if she is really taking over the system. And the takeover in the last few years has been pretty dramatic in some places.
Well, my understanding is that London in the UK plans to move.
London in the UK plans to move.
Mhm.
Where? Because the UK also has
Uphill.
uphill. Okay, yes, right. That wouldn't be a bad idea. But you know, the UK is also a poorly managed planet, a poorly managed country at the moment, from the perspective that I'm taking here. And yes, they may be forced to. They may be forced to.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I can't
Dave.
answer most of your questions.
Well, they're really observations anyway. Thank you.
Pleasure.
There are points for us to contemplate. And Amir Hakimi, you now have the floor, and Art Hunter is on deck. Amir, can you speak to us? There we go. Turn on your video.
I didn't really have a question. It was a comment on a comment, but I did want to thank Alan for the very interesting presentation. And also, you know, I did find it fascinating that you became interested in indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing long before, much long before it became fashionable, for the lack of a better word. So it was really interesting. My comment was about the air pollution impact of shipping, and I think thank you, Dave, for correcting me that it is significant. And yeah, so basically that has been a challenge that we have faced since we knew that sulfur dioxide or sulfate particles cool the planet. So removing them, there is a good reason for removing them, human health, but it does have the side effect of removing that cooling as well.
Well, I don't have a miracle solution for that one, and the role of shipping on the planet, and the management of shipping on the planet, and what they're shipping as well, all those kinds of things. I don't have any analysis of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mary Hagan is on deck, and Art, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment following up from Paul Beckwith, who said the Ottawa Writers' Festival is on the 4th of May, and I believe that is going to be virtual as well as in person, which means that anyone can plug into it. Michael Mann is talking at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the 4th of May, and Gwen Dyer is talking at noon. And you can just I put it in the chat that you can go to they have a website, and I put the link in chat, and we will of course publish that link. I just also wanted to make a comment following Dave Doherty's comment, and that's with regards to saying we have all the technology today to go off and really take a big chunk out of burning of fossil fuels and potentially eliminating it. There are, of course, many things that are happening along those lines now. With, you see pictures quite regularly of massive solar panel farms and wind farms and big batteries, and there's a lot of movement going on in trying to resurrect the nuclear industry again and start generating energy that way. And whether or not that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, I'm of two minds. Clearly, if you have an infinite source of energy, it just means that you go off and you abuse the earth with added vigor. And you mine more, and you manufacture more, and you're not following the indigenous philosophy. But at the same time, you can be off and not dependent on the burning of fossil fuels to heat your home and grow food and all those things, which we need to survive. So it's one of those double-edged swords that exists, and I suspect that Mother Nature is coming up for a population correction, because we just don't get it, and ultimately the the desire to make money out of nature is not going to be corrected without some considerable suffering. Your comments on that, Al?
Yeah, well, let me just comment directly on the I took over the management of a a solar array in the west edge of Vermont about 3 or 4 years ago, when the company was simply stripping it of money and declared bankruptcy. It cost me $1, and I got the agreement of the state of Vermont that I could take it over, again with zero bureaucracy, as us, the owners of the panels. We took it over. We have run it now for a bunch of years. It runs smoothly. It powers 60 people to varying degrees with solar electricity. So I have a seat in that world also, and I understand all the parts of it and the facets of it. And it's not being run as a commercial operation. It's being run to get power to the people that own the panels in a zero bureaucratic system. And that's perfectly easy to do. And it's made a huge difference in our ability, of course, in this case, to manage our own budgets. And so the solar panels thing, I have a deep understanding. It cost me $1, right? And we as a collective group funded all the things that the corporation that was running it had neglected, allowed to go collapse and so on. We simply funded it collectively. And what we did collectively is still running 5 years later, 4 or 5. I lost track of time in that one. So I would like to see that same model, which is small groups of people take over the solar power systems of the planet. Because again, when they're being run with a corporate interest, there's always these other agendas. Okay. And that you don't need that to supply people with the power that they can use to simplify all their costs.
Understand.
So it doesn't answer your question. It's a comment on your question, just because I watch all the growth of power systems that are part of much bigger enterprises, and I'm always aware of this issue. Is are they really running it because they were interested in seeing solar power take over, or are they just running it for other agendas in mind? Most of them have the solar power agenda in mind, but I don't get, of course, I don't have the time to work on their actual agendas.
Okay, let me just inform you then about one big movement that has started and is growing quite substantially in the US and Europe. and just starting up in Canada. And that's the concept of a virtual power plant. And my system now is part of that virtual power plant, whereby I am connected to the grid and I trade with the grid every second of every day of the year. This means that any solar energy that is being generated on my system is dumped on the grid, and I get credits for that in dollars, and I can time shift. For example, charging my electric vehicles to the low energy rate, and that low energy rate is very attractive. It's 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour compared to the peak time where it's 28 cents per kilowatt hour, which says that it's worth your while as a small person, as one home, to in fact essentially provide green energy into the grid, which is helping your neighbors and all customers, as well as yourself. There is a financial incentive then as well that says, if you manage this properly, you don't pay any energy costs at all.
Yeah. Well, I entirely agree.
This is proliferating. I'm
Yes.
saying that it is exactly as you've just said. It is the small person. It's the small virtual power plant. And in fact, that can grow to community size. And you can have multiple community associations are everywhere. And those community associations can take charge at the local level, notwithstanding whatever is happening at the coal burning plant many hundreds of miles away, you know?
Well, absolutely. And any type of system that gives you local storage, and we're seeing ones that I'm trying to dredge my mind. I haven't got one, of what the technology of them is that are using storage systems so that you have a local power system of yourself that can be connected in the ways you're discussing. Any of those are a good idea. They don't basically cost, and they diversify, stabilize, connect, and as you say, reduce the inherent costs in your power supply and connect you to your neighbors and stabilize the system on a local level. Great ideas. Yes, just go for them. I'm in a, I get close to free power for the year because I have this link to a power system, and I get the power out of that system. I also have a big share in managing the actual system and managing I'm trying to trace the thread of things here. I probably can't do it, not at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you. We're running a little low on time. We have two
Okay.
more questioners. First, Mary Hagan, and then followed by Mike Nickerson. And Mary, did you leave?
No.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
She's here.
I love the conversation on microgrids and communities taking over and producing and looking after their renewable energy systems. But I'm back to nature for a minute. And my question to the group is, can we not model our own behaviors to learn from and follow what we learned from nature? And I feel if we just were committed and there's nobody to stop us and say we as a group or a grouping cannot just really learn from nature and take the good aspects and how they're coping. And we'll soon find out that that's very powerful. It's successful. And if we're still hung up on money, it's very affordable. So my comment is, how do we learn from nature where we're at right now?
Yeah. I simply grow my own food. That's a very simple thing from the natural perspective. I'm losing track now of what I did last year because I'm losing my short-term memory for that. But I'm also connected to a network of suppliers. And the network of suppliers are also growing things that I may not be able to grow, and we can exchange them at essentially whatever the cost of the person growing them is. So I don't really have, you're asking actually a deeper question, is what can we learn from the mentality of the nature human, of the natural connection of indigenous people? And that's much more difficult for us because they have much longer term perspectives than our society does. They have got a real indigenous community has got used to the fact that they just grow their stuff and they connect and they fill in the gaps where they can with the natural world, and they may go into the natural world for resources that are easier to take simply from the natural environment around them. And most of that we can't do. We just don't have that conception. And we spent so much time, and I can't pretend I have analyzed it other than to watch how stable on the long-term indigenous communities' view and management of their resources is. I can't pretend I've actually gone in and analyzed it, but the ability, I just look at the humorous examples, and I'll give you one of them, and it probably won't help you, but it shows is that a plane crashed somewhere in South America with a mother and 4 children on it. And the mother was killed. She died in the accident. She lived long enough to explain to her 4 children, 2 of whom were 14 and 9, trained by their grandfather in how to survive in the wilderness, with a 5-year-old and a baby. And she explained to them that those older kids had to just take the younger kids into the desert, into the forest, and survive, use all their skills to survive. And they did for the next 30 days. They knew what to eat, what not to eat. They knew how to feed, water themselves. They knew how to feed, transfer it down to their children, the little children. And they knew how to hide from all the nasty people in the forest. They knew how to live in that forest and maintain their health. They had been trained to do that in this very intimate relationship, and nobody could find them. They just disappeared. And finally, their grandfather, who had trained them, said, well, I understand, you will need my help. And took something to put him into a trance for 24 hours, some herb or other. And he said, I have located them. I will, because the rescue people were wandering along the edge of the forest, and these kids did not emerge. They did not emerge. They couldn't find them. They had no idea where they'd gone. They went, let's just say 15, I have no idea where they went, a long way, maybe 50 miles. The grandfather identified where they were, located them, and gave the information, and came out so that he knew where they were. And they were brought back into his world. And the older people, the 2 older kids, were all, the whole group of 4 were in perfect health. They had kept that health because they knew what to do in this intimate connection of the indigenous world. And they came out, greeted their grandfather, who basically said, "They're in there." And the 5-year-old was really sad. His first remark was, "My mother has been killed." And the baby had been fed by the older kids for 30 days. It's perfect health. So I don't know why you prompted me to say that. I haven't lived in that world, but the indigenous people's world is something to really treat with reverence and understand as deeply as we can, because they don't live in our financial structured universe where the finance is critical.
Thank you.
You've disappeared. You've gone silent, Claude. You've turned off, Claude.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had the alarm clock going. That's a great summary, what you just said off the top of your head. Thank you so much. Our last questioner comment is Mike Nickerson, before we turn it over to Ted Manning, who is chair and who will give you our official thanks. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, well, Alan, I'm delighted that you've brought this alternate perspective to CACOR. It's often looking, so much information that's flowing through is all looking from the industrial capitalist perspective, and clearly that's grown to beyond the extent that the earth can handle. So you've very clearly indicated the other side of a divide that we need to be living from. My comment had to do with just being amazed that there's so much stuff being consumed, that there's enough enormous boats crossing the oceans to change the climate. But more, I want to resonate with the idea of how do we change the purpose of our society? Earn and spend as much as possible, that's passé. Living lightly, enjoying life, and managing the world for future generations is moving into its place as legitimacy. We have a program that goes by the code meme of more fun, less stuff, which is introducing the challenge or the question of, well, do we want to grow until we drop, or do we want to develop an economic system that takes care of people and ecosystems? So thank you very much for your contribution. I will be telling some folks about this when it's on the net. Thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. But notice what I'm actually saying is we are not going to have a choice. That is very, very difficult for both our scientists and our society and all our political structures to face.
It will open up the possibility of people looking at what else might happen, even if it's just sort of the dregs that are going to be able to recreate.
And they're not going to, they should not be facing it with just simply frustration and anger. We've got to undo this with our technology. They have to face the fact that we are not in charge. And that's, given the thousands of years of male power that the Emperor of Rome insisted on, is not going to be easy at all. And it's not easy on the individual level. It's easier for me because I've lived in the parallel universe for at least 50, 60, 70 years of various forms, understanding it bit by bit as I went along. And I've never had to change direction. So anyway, thank you for your comment, and thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ted.
Alan, thank you very much. We always need our minds broadened, and you've certainly taken us in that direction. I wake up most mornings pissed off, as many of our members do. And I'm just asking myself, I wonder how pissed off Gaia is. The fact is that so many of the people in the world really never consider their links to the rest of the world, to nature, to anything else. And they have been largely programmed, as I think many of our speakers have said. You certainly have pointed this out as well, that the power has been vested in very certain places, and people are simply moved around as pawns in order to support the power grabs of individual people. The other thing that I thought came out of what you said and some of the other speakers is, quite frankly, it's not up to what we invest on or who we vote or whatever. It is up to our own behaviors. And if we are not able to alter those, we are highly unlikely to be able to come back to be in harmony in some way with the rest of the planet that we live on. So I thank you ever so much for raising these questions. And I will now go to the commercial, which lets us keep doing these presentations. If you are not a member now, we would encourage you to join. It's for those of you who are members and who have forgotten to pay your membership. It's right there on http://canadiancore.com, and you can go in as well to see what's going on in the club on a regular basis. We also say that everything that we are producing these days is put on YouTube. And if you are doing that, please hit subscribe, because that makes us a little more capable of accessing other people. So once again, I would thank you very much for coming on, and I hope you we can now free up the mics and the video and go off and have a general conversation offline.